Thank you all for tuning into this collaborative program, Telepsychology and Psychology Law Practice Experiences, Recommendation, and What's to Come, which is part of the 2021 Virtual APA Convention. Okay, so first I want to acknowledge the following divisions, particularly Division 41, which is serving as the lead for throwing their support behind this set of presentations today. We hope that the content discussed here will be relevant even if you are not working directly or exclusively in forensic or correctional settings. We're very fortunate to have such a diverse range of talent and expertise involved in this program. I'm Ashley Batastini. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Memphis in the Department of Counseling, Educational Research, or Educational Psychology and Research, a little bit of a mouthful there. I'm going to let our other distinguished speakers talk more about themselves and their work during their respective presentations. But we're also really grateful to have Dr. Alexander Milkey, who is serving as our moderator and discussant for the latter portion of the program, where we'll have an open discussion with all of the presenters. We are pre-recording this program live. I'm not really sure how else to describe that, but what I mean is that we are all here together in one Zoom room. So there may be, and in fact have already been, some natural imperfections in the presentations as we go along. So we have not, we're pre-recording this as we're going along. We're also going to be starting and stopping the recording to transition between speakers just to save you from that dead and awkward time in between. And then finally, even though we're not able to engage with you in real time, we've each built in some interactive elements that are intended to get you thinking about the content in a little bit more depth. So this might be a good time to pull out a sheet of notebook paper or a blank Word document so that you can play along with us. I also want to briefly remind you that there is a 16-question multiple choice quiz that you need to pass at a rate of at least 75% in order to earn your continuing education credits. So just a little bit of a motivator to pay attention. All right, for logistic reasons, we're going to kind of switch the order up a little bit as it may appear in the convention program. So you'll be hearing from me for just a little while longer while I talk about the current state of the literature and moving the science forward when working remotely with justice involved populations. And I've organized this part of the talk in two general sections. So one is pre-COVID, what was going on in terms of the research and the use of telepsychology before the pandemic hit us, and then what has transpired since the onset of the pandemic. A lot of you may not realize just how much attention or focus there was on telepsychology even before the pandemic was kind of taking over our lives. And a lot of this was coming mostly from increased attention on improving rural mental health care or rural health care in general. And the Department of Defense, also through their technology transfer program, played a large role in the advancement of teletherapy, including video conferencing and e-therapy apps. And in fact, they're still pretty much at the forefront of research and application of these technologies. So a couple of things that we observed with this increased attention on telepsychology was number one, a more rapid expansion of large scale telehealth networks. Julio is going to be presenting later, is going to talk to you about one of them in Mississippi. We also saw the establishment of the PsyPact. This is the Psychology Interjurisdictional Compact, which is allowing people to practice telepsychology across state lines. We saw the development of certain practice guidelines from the American Psychological Association, from the American Telemedicine Association, and the other APA, the American Psychiatric Association. We also saw a lot more specific funding opportunities, for example, through the Health Resources and Services Administration. and of course, increased research, generally speaking, and other focused publications. Just to give you a couple examples of what was going on pre-pandemic, this one here feels a little bit eerie after living through the past year and a half. But essentially, what Norcross and colleagues predicted was that there would be the highest expansion of telepsychology as one of the advancements in psychotherapy in the future. This one here, which is a commentary that came out in 2015, also kind of hails technology as a key to solving mental health care access problems in the 21st century. This is from the APA Monitor for psychologists in their 2017 Trends report, talked about the use of telepsychology, which was expanding from being primarily focused on rural populations to being something that was more integrated into general practice. This survey from 2016 showed that about 70% of behavioral health professionals had reported providing services remotely. Nearly 40% had used video conferencing as an adjunctive to in-person services, and a little under 50% had used video conferencing by itself. Pre-COVID, there was kind of this unspoken green light to move full speed ahead with telepsychological practice. Yet, comparatively speaking, there was relatively little research examining the nuances of using remote technologies in mental health service provision. For example, understanding what works and for whom, who's best suited for remote services, and what was available seemed to be somewhat lacking in quality. A large proportion of the research focused on things like acceptability, satisfaction, feasibility, or just describing models of program initiation. And a lot of the program outcome or evaluation research was pre-post in nature and didn't have an in-person comparison group. So there was kind of this imbalance between practice and research quality. Based on what literature was available at the time, my colleagues and I decided to pool studies together that somehow compared a remote versus an in-person outcome to see if we could shed some light on the answer to this particular question. Are remote services just as good as in-person services? I encourage you to stop and think for a minute and consider what your answer would be if you were asked this question, and whether your answer would be different before the pandemic versus now. So this is our published study. I'm showing a screenshot here so that you can find the reference later if you want to. But I'll give you an overview here. This was a large-scale meta-analysis, the largest meta-analysis that I'm aware of, that looked at both intervention and assessment outcomes, again, across in-person and video conferencing. We looked primarily at adults, a variety of settings, including prisons. There were two that were within prison populations, different types of clients presenting concerns, and a variety of services. So counseling, psychiatric medication management, psychodiagnostic evaluations, things like that. So in terms of the intervention outcomes, we had 43 total studies up to 2019. So these were not studies that came out during the pandemic. And what you'll see here is a p-value of 0.7, suggesting that we did not really find significant differences in intervention outcomes across those two treatment modalities. And for assessment reliability, we had fewer studies here, but we had 14 and found pretty much the same outcomes. So again, non-significant alpha levels, and you can see the Hedges G here is a measure of the effect size. So what we were able to conclude here is that in most cases, being in the room with a client does not seem to result in significantly different treatment outcomes or assessment decisions compared to video sessions. Now, obviously, there were a number of limitations in this research. For example, a lot of studies had small sample sizes, didn't report things that we would have wanted them to report, and I'm going to get into some of that a little bit later. However, in pre-pandemic forensic work, and even during, especially at the start, people seem to be pretty vocally concerned about how well it would hold up in court, whether they'd be challenged, whether data germane to certain psycholegal questions would be lost. And there seemed to be some pushback from the professional community. I know that I saw some opposition on listservs and just talking with folks about this. And there was even less research specifically within legal context to ease some of this hesitation and resistance. I want to highlight this meta-analysis that we did back in 2015. That was obviously before the more general meta-analysis, and I think we were able to summarize most what was available here. Or available in the literature. And some of the studies were able to be meta-analyzed and some were not, but we provided a review of them nonetheless. So this was obviously a much smaller meta-analysis, but we likewise found little evidence that service modality mattered even in these contexts. I want to, this one was meta-analyzed in our 2015 publication, but I want to draw some specific attention to this one. Um, there were some other studies focused on forensic mental health assessment, but this one, and I believe still to this day, is the only one that implemented a randomized procedure. So I think it's an important one to highlight. This was, again, a randomized study of remote competency to stand trial evaluations using the Georgia Court Competency test. And results showed pretty high levels of inter-rater agreement. I want to highlight this 0.93 here. So under the telemedicine condition, this was the condition in which somebody was completing the competency test in live with the person, and then there was also somebody completing it remotely. And so this is the actual comparison the Pearsons are between the in-person and the remote person. Okay. What about correctional treatment services? This is one that came out after our smaller meta-analysis, so it wasn't included in there. But this one, which was actually based on my dissertation, was looking at the use of telepsychology to deliver group treatment, small groups for inmates in segregated housing. And so again, what we found was that there weren't a lot of group differences across the video conference group, an in-person group, and a no treatment control. This study did have a pretty small sample size of only 49 participants, and we weren't able to use random assignments. So there were, again, some limitations in this research. Another important question is acceptability, right? If providers or clients are unaccepting of remote technologies, it won't really matter that much if they produce similar outcomes. So I want to highlight a couple areas of research here, again, most of which was done prior to the pandemic. In general, we find that providers with experience tend to perceive telepractice more favorably. We showed that recently among forensic practitioners, but it's been shown among practitioners in general. Clients also generally report satisfaction that's on par with in-person services. And usually when they're reporting dissatisfaction, it seems to be more related to problems with the technology, like technological issues or low bandwidth that might cause distortions in audio visual and things like that. But it's most often not related to things like rapport building, for example. This is from our 2019 survey, and I wanted to, oops, there we go. This is from our 2019 survey, and what you'll see here is we actually did two studies. This is a two-part study. The first column there under study 1, these are forensic practitioners, and the second column there under study 2 is a relatively small sample of attorney perceptions. And what you're seeing here is the top things that people identified as being potential consequences of video conferencing. And I think these are fair criticisms, like things like not being able to administer some certain measures as well. Risk of technical difficulties, loss of important behavioral data. And there's some debate on whether the loss of that data is really meaningful, those data are really meaningful or not. People also pinpointed things like potential difficulty establishing rapport or higher risks of confidentiality. So these are some of the pre-pandemic kinds of concerns that people expressed about forensic assessment. All right, so what happened during COVID? Obviously, there was a massive shift in how people were having to practice. Prior to this, people who weren't really thinking about telepractice, just weren't, looking that much into it. And so all of a sudden, they're needing to prioritize telepractice or make a decision to put their practices on hold for some indeterminate amount of time. And so what we saw in this period was a rapid release of guidance from divisions and committees within APA and related organizations. So for example, Division 12, Section 9, which is their section on assessment, came out with general guidance on teleassessment. The IOPC, the Interorganizational Practice Committee, which released some recommendations for teleneuropsychology in response to COVID. We also, I'm sure you've seen, these were some unavoidable things that I'm sure you were exposed to, but increased discussion on listservs about how to do this, webinars, virtual training. Pearson and Parr had a lot of promotional materials that came out. We saw increases in special issues in academic journals like Psychology, Public Policy and Law, Law and Human Behavior. There's an upcoming one in criminal justice behavior. And a lot of this work was coming from the trenches, and it was mostly descriptive of what people were doing to accommodate and to continue serving justice involved individuals. And not surprisingly, some of this work also focused on surveying changes in practice. Oops, I realize I'm not clicking with my words. So this is one of those that came out in 2021, so earlier this year, on remote forensic evaluations and treatment in the time of COVID-19. And so what this table is showing you, this is from the article, is showing you increases in assessment and interventions before and after COVID. So just highlight two here: use of telephone and use of audio-visual conferencing. So I think it's interesting to see that, for example, before the pandemic, we had about 36% of people using remote technologies for assessment, and that went up to about 60%. And in terms of treatment, we went from 16 to about 28%. All right, we certainly have a lot more work to do in terms of research, and doing highly controlled studies was of course limited by the pandemic. There wasn't a real opportunity to compare directly to in person due to safety concerns and other logistics. And a lot of research, including some research that I was doing at the time and still am trying to do, was just paused during this time. So while published articles about telepsychology have increased since COVID-19, there still is a scarcity of controlled experimental designs. And to show you this just very briefly, I did a quick cursory psych info search, and I looked at telepsychology or telehealth and forensic and jail or prisoner incarceration and justice involved. So these were three separate searches that I ran. And some of these numbers actually represent duplicate articles that came up across these searches. So you're seeing some review, commentary. Our meta-analysis popped up from earlier this year. Some program descriptions, again, surveys, a policy review here. And obviously this isn't an exhaustive combination of search terms or article databases, and it doesn't represent a systematic attempt to pull all articles, but it shows that there, again, really aren't that many empirical studies for many of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. One initiative that Division 41 pursued after COVID hit was the creation of a website with relevant resources for the practice of forensic and correctional psychology. So if you want to find out more what's out there, both before and during the pandemic, this is a good place to go. I don't believe that it's updated constantly, but it should give you a good place to start to look for these resources. And they've tried to organize it in the sense that you can find forensic specific, non-specific, and then other kinds of general telehealth resources. So where have we landed as a field? I'm not really sure that we have landed anywhere. We're in much the same place as we were before, in the sense that high quality, controlled research is lacking. But there does seem to be more acceptance and a greater sense of importance in pursuing these efforts. So it's my hope that we will step up and kind of walk the walk by keeping technological advancements at the forefront of research innovation. Lauren Coy and her colleagues had one of these review commentary articles come out in 2021, and I liked what they had to say here. They said, we find that there is ample opportunity for leveraging technology to improve forensic mental health practice, research, and policy. And I hope that we as a field seize this opportunity. To give you a couple of areas of research that I see and going forward is one, whether the use of telepsychology changes after the pandemic, things like frequency, the types of referral questions that we're seeing, client characteristics. Do we see changes in perceptions and experiences in using telepsychology in different contexts? And perceptions could be of experts, of attorneys, of the clients themselves. Um, Agreement with existing guidance or recommendations? Do we as a field, and again, we're going to talk a little bit more about Division 41 specific guidance that we're working on, and so seeing if there's some consensus about those guidelines. Whether telepsychology can leads to differential outcomes. For example, triage and treatment planning decisions, psycholegal opinions, court decisions, things like that. Differences in practice standards. So we have some surveys about what people are doing or how people may have changed their practice, but what about consent forms, modifications to assessments? What types of video platforms are people using? What are some things that people have changed about how they are having to report these things in written documentation or communication with courts? How to address and assess cultural and diversity factors, like are there differences with older adults? What about the use of closed captioning, the role of interpreters? And certainly more studies using random assignment with larger samples. And Lauren's study that I mentioned a minute ago also lists a number of good suggestions specific to forensic work. Here's a place in the presentation where you may want to pause for a minute and just stop and think about these questions. I'm going to pose a couple questions, and I want you to really think about what your answers would be and how you could, in your own practice or in your own work setting, be a little bit more conscientious about research. So one question is, could you explore any of these ideas in your own work or within your own agency? Have you started any of this work yet? And if not, what might you consider to be your first step? What's this next step after that? What are some challenges you might anticipate in working towards research or program evaluation? Is it money? Is it buy-in? Is it administrators, frontline workers who might have issue? What about participation from clients, defendants, attorneys, whoever your participants are going to be? What are some challenges you might anticipate? And how could you overcome some of those challenges? The final thing I want to talk about, hopefully very briefly, is research reporting recommendations. And a lot of what I'm going to say here is outlined in our 2021 meta-analysis, coming off of some of the challenges that we experienced or that we noticed with that research, and people not reporting things that we might have expected them to report. The overarching suggestion I have here is to think about the end before the beginning. You don't want to get to the end of your project and realize that you should have been reporting something, but you never tracked it or assessed for it. So think about what information you want and should be disseminated at the outset. So very quickly, I've organized this into 6 categories, one of which is participant descriptors. Are the participants clients, service providers, attorneys? What is some information about those participants? Reporting the total sample size and the sample size by condition, in person, video, for example. Site descriptors, reporting where the remote clients are getting services, where the in-person people are getting services, where the providers are in the same place as the clients or not. Technology descriptors, this is a really important one, right? And considering technology both from the provider and remote, from the client perspective, okay, because again, it's not necessarily the same. So are they using Zoom, Polycom, Cisco, WebEx, things like that? Are clients working from their own computers or tablets? Are they on their phones? What are people using in terms of equipment? And what's it provided to people? What are some of the resolution, any connection loss issues, audio visual delays, picture distortions, other kinds of barriers that might have been encountered. Service descriptors, screening procedures, goals of the service. Is it for competency restoration, symptom reduction, recidivism reduction, medication compliance? Is it about therapy, evaluation, education, or training? Were there any modifications that needed to be made to the virtual platform that may have been different from the in-person service? Provider descriptors include things like, who were the providers? Was one person always the in-person provider and one person was the remote provider? Did one person deliver all the services? Were there any differences between the providers? Any specific training requirements that they went through to deliver the remote services? And finally, of course, research descriptors. These are things that we would report anyway in research studies, right? The final note I want to leave you with is that I believe all work should really be empirical work. Through some of the work that I've done so far, it's become clear that people are not being thorough in their program evaluations or even doing a good job considering what information will be helpful to other people. So, to truly inform best practices, we need to come to view everything we do program wise as an empirical effort. And because this work is relatively new and it's at the forefront of our practice now, people want to learn about it. So treat your work like a research project, maybe even reach out to academics like myself or others doing this work to collaborate and get help in compiling data and publish and present your findings. Even if your N is one, meaning yourself, I encourage you to think empirically. For example, in forensic evaluations, you can track decisions and whether they differ based on how the person was evaluated. You can code for technological or other barriers that came up during your remote evaluations, whether you encountered specific challenges on cross-examination related to your use of technology. All of those things are worthy data points to keep track of. So I've been talking long enough, but I will just kind of flash my contact information on there, and I would welcome anyone to contact me if you have questions, comments, or just want to talk more about how to get good quality research out there for people to consume.
Hello, everyone. We are going to talk about resilience and adaptation in the jail setting, and in particular talk about a conversion that we made during COVID-19 from everything being in person to telehealth. My name is Tina Schwenke, and I'm Emory as a therapist there, as well as a professor and a director of the Competency Restoration Program.
And I am Douglas Lewis. I am currently a clinical and forensic psychologist for the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. And also I have an adjunct appointment as an assistant professor with Emory University School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. But previously I was a postdoctoral resident and I worked with Tamina Swinkie as a postdoctoral resident in the Department of Psychiatry and Law Service.
And what we hope to talk about most or focus on is the work that we did in terms of modifying our curriculum and our programming and how we were able to work together to develop training and also modify all the kinds of groups, evaluations, and research that we got involved in. And so that will be the focus of how that shift happened. We're also going to talk about some of the special programs that we inserted into our programming that were kind of unique and novel, in our opinion. And then we'll focus a little bit on the supervision, and because we're at Emory, we have a lot of trainees, psychiatry and psychology. So how we made efforts to make sure that people were getting a training year that was effective, helpful, and not overly stressful.
And I'd add training that is probably more relevant to the new developments that we have with the onset of COVID-19. So why do we even consider or work with justice involved individuals regarding competency restoration? It's because of the Deslich standard, which indicates, as it says here, it's a test that whether the defendant or justice involved individual has sufficient present ability to consult with his lawyer with a reasonable degree of rational understanding, and whether he has a rational as well as factual understanding of the proceedings against him. And for those who are not familiar with the competency restoration process, when someone is opined not competent to stand trial by the trier of fact, essentially the evaluator decides whether or not they have the ability or the capacity to be restored. Should it be found that they can be restored, then typically individuals go through competency restoration, and that restoration is generally or usually in hospitals, but in more recent years or times, there have been opportunities for jail-based competency restoration, which we will be discussing at length, as well as outpatient restoration services.
So one thing that we know is competency evaluations are prevalent. About 60,000 defendants in the United States are referred for competency evaluations. And we know, according to Pirelli and colleagues from 2011, that about 27% of those are IST. So that's a large number of people. And we also know that the forensic beds in the state hospital are not prevalent. So I say that to give you a foundation of why our program got started and the impetus and motivation for it. But we were having delays in having people even receive competency restoration services, and also the resources and funding was overextended to do so. So that's kind of the foundation of how our program got started. It was out of that need to serve a very large amount of people. And this slide just walks you through some of the continuum of services that we offer through our program. And so even though I'm going to talk mostly about competency restoration and what we do on our unit, we do a lot of other things. And so the Psychiatry and Law Service is a program that has been around for a very long time and exclusively did the evaluations for Fulton County Jail, which Fulton County is not just the jail, but for the county in general. It's a large urban county in Atlanta. And so once the evaluator suspects or opines somebody competent to stand trial, then they become part of this restoration system. And on the slide, it says extended evaluation, which is something our program does in those cases where there's a differential diagnosis that's needed, or there's some confusion about whether or not somebody's malingering, or whether or not their cognitive impairment is such that they may not ever be restored to competency. So essentially what it means is what it says. It's an extended opportunity to evaluate someone. So we'll bring someone on do some more testing, do some parallel assessments where we can see them interacting with others on the unit, but it's a real opportunity for us to make a decision that makes sense for that particular person. And that's really what this continuum of care is that we look at the individual and try to factor in what that particular person needs. So when I talk about not being competent, there's the people that we opine as incompetent to stand trial, but then there's a subset of people that the court has already said are incompetent to stand trial, or so they're adjudicated incompetent. Regardless, the continuum is some of the people are admitted to the hospital, we defer them out, and some of the people come to our competency restoration program. Other people who we screen for a variety of reasons as not appropriate or unable to come to our program are actually seen in the general population. And we'll have people that go out to see them in their respective units as opposed to on our unit. And then we do outpatient restoration. Those are for people who are on bond in the community, et cetera. And there's a fair amount of work that myself and Vicki Roberts and a couple of other people do to divert cases. So we try to basically communicate with the court and with the attorneys and get some of those cases that can be diverted.
And I'd add that Deborah Pinels, who is a forensic psychiatrist, developed what is called the sequence intercept model, which, or the sequential intercept model, wherein she's trying to find ways to divert or keep the population of those who have mental illness of some type or some type of cognitive defect out of the jail or the correctional system. And I think that a lot of the work that is done at Emory attempts to or strives to do that very thing.
And that article, the Pinels article, is one that we read regularly for inspiration.
Absolutely.
So I talked a little bit about the pros of our program and why it was started and why a lot of the jail-based competency restoration programs are in effect, which is essentially because of the shortage of hospital beds in the forensic hospitals. The cost is appealing. And also for our program, we are able to weed out some of the lingering issues as well as divert cases. Some of the cons are pretty substantial also, and there's a lot of arguments like Kapoor that maybe there's no real place for jail-based competency restoration because it really is not the same equivalent as inpatient hospitalization. There's visitation challenges. We have issues with medication that people don't typically have in the hospital. And we also are not able to, as much as we would like to and strive to, make the milieu very therapeutic. We're still in a jail setting. We still have guards on our unit. We still have issues that people have in the jail, and that those vary, but they're just not the same. I'm thinking of even right now that we're having an issue with getting people haircuts and their fingernails clipped and things like that, that are not the same kind of things that are happening in hospitals that are a little more dehumanizing or a little more jail specific.
Well, I'll take a time in terms of trying to be interactive. I will say, just take a pause for a second. And Tamina kind of alluded to this with the pros and cons, and think about what the primary and foremost issue or criticism of jail-based competency restoration might be. So, assuming that you all guessed it, it is the fact that the milieu environment, or the what they call the therapeutic environment, is arguably missing from jail-based competency restoration programs as they are currently constructed. However, as Tamina alluded to earlier, the program at Emory has some unique features that we believe presents a novel or unique model that may very likely more so align with the milieu environment or the hospital setting.
Just as a quick introduction, our program was founded in 2011. We are in Atlanta, as I mentioned, and we're a collaborative program that integrates the Department of Behavioral Health, Emory University, and the Fulton County Jail. So we work closely with all of those entities, which is an important part of what makes it successful, because we are not separate from the jail. We're visitors in the jail, but we are also working closely with the larger state system to make sure that we can provide that continuum of care. We're a self-contained unit based in the mental health area of the jail. And there's 16 individuals that are on our pod at any given time. And the reason for people coming, statistically, we've found about 72% are psychotic, 10% have cognitive impairments, and then 13% of the individuals we code as having both issues with psychosis as well as some kind of cognitive impairment. And we do testing and whatnot to establish what it means to have a cognitive impairment. So we have, like I said, difficulties with the medication, but we work closely with the nursing staff to try to make sure that as many people who want to take medicine do, and to encourage while they're on the unit compliance with medication, because we know that's such an important part of competency. So our outcome data from our 2020 paper suggests that about 40% of the people in our study, so across time, have been restored, 31% have been diverted in some way, and 29% are referred to the inpatient hospital. And we were actually surprised at the high diversion rates, which we could talk about that at a different time, probably. This is just a visual of what our unit looks like. You can see there's office spaces that are converted jail cells, and that's where we do our work. And then we have the day area where we see patients for groups, for psych testing, and for individual therapy. I wanted to just add a little piece about some of the scheduling that we do. We have robust scheduling. We have groups that run about 25 to 30. This is pre-COVID, 25 to 30 groups per week. We also, each person who comes to our unit also has a one-on-one support professional, and they do what we call counseling. That's either provided by our master level clinicians or by our postdocs, sometimes by our prac students, or sometimes even by the interns. We also make sure that each person is assigned a psychiatrist when they come onto the unit. So we have Emory Psychiatry comes and monitors and has the med clinics with their individual clients. So it's really a group effort that includes psychiatry, psychology, as well as our staff members. Those are the lists of the people that are directly involved. There's the facility director and medical director. There's also, we have a program director, Dr. Ash. We also have a court liaison, Vicki Roberts. We have 2 clinicians that are master's level that are called behavior specialists. They run a lot of our groups, do a lot of behind the scenes work, and also help with just, I mentioned the issue about hygiene, like with people who needing haircuts and nails. They do a lot of that kind of follow-up, which is real critical. And then we work with the nursing staff and the security staff at the jail. I also want to add that our trainees are particularly important to running the program. They do the evaluations, they do screenings for us, they do all kinds of things. So I wanted to say, just by means of potential test questions, that our programming includes a whole bunch of things: one-on-one, robust group treatment, assignment to a psychiatrist, but does not include access to a gym.
So, in terms of the novel or unique model that we already had established, of course, with the onset of COVID-19, telehealth services had to be added. And it's important to note that telepsychology and telepsychiatry has been found to be quite useful, as was alluded to in the first presentation that you viewed. Changes in the judicial system um, were prompted by the onset of COVID-19, particularly in our jurisdiction. So minor infractions or offenses like jaywalking or maybe public urination were infractions that people weren't necessarily arrested and detained for. Um, and so for that reason, there was a lot of diversion that happened within the jail. People were bonded out, or they or no pros, just depending on what was going on and what particulars of the cases were, in order to try to limit the number of individuals that were detained or incarcerated in Fulton County Jail. So having said that, they also limited the number of visitors. And for that reason, there were certain aspects of the programming that we were offering in person that needed to be moved to telehealth services to follow the guidelines, the health guidelines as set forth by the jail, as well as for the safety of the staff and the trainees working within the program.
So we did make a lot of adjustments due to COVID. We had to start slowly. We used the infrastructure that was available to us, which included the jail phones. When we were unable to get into the jail, we would be able to call in using the Securus phones, and we are able to use the visitation that typically the inmates would use with family members or attorneys in order to make some kind of contact. Then over time, we actually were able to get laptops into the jail and do Zoom calls with the people that we were working with. We were also able to get an external camera so we could run groups more easily and hear people a little bit better. We also had iPads set up for some interactive cognitive remediation type stuff. And we started to phase out the infrastructure that was with the jail. However, we did not, prior to COVID, have access to things like the medical records or the jail. It's called Odyssey, which is the jail access data for inmates. So that was something new that happened. We were granted that access, and we started to coordinate more closely remotely with medical and security. And one of the things that became a big responsibility of the postdocs was actually training the officers how to use Zoom, how to use all kinds of different technologies that not only were they unfamiliar with, they were not expecting. It was not really part of their job. And they did it with good spirit, partially because the postdocs were so approachable and supportive, but that was a challenge to our original setting up of the system. So what ended up happening was we had to change our evaluation schedule. We went from doing like 12 evaluations a week to only doing a trickling of them. And slowly we've worked up again. But we also have changed some of our groups. We had to have like 2 or 3 groups a day as opposed to, 6 or 7. And we had to just reduce the amount of stress that we are putting the officers on in terms of getting on and off Zoom and calling people, etc. We also changed our supervision style, and our screening process changed a bit. Also, we I've mentioned a couple of times that we do psych testing. We had to change our battery of testing so that it could be done on the computer, or it could be done in the attorney's booth. So we had to reduce things like it became impossible to do, we used to do WASIs on everybody, but with block design, we changed the system a bit so that we were able to do the 2 subtests as opposed to all 4. Those sorts of adjustments we made along the way. So I know we're running short on time, so I'll just direct you to the fact that, again, we changed a lot of things. And one of the main things that we changed was the way that we did our business meetings. So we used to have team meeting and research meetings and all kinds of supervision in person. We shifted that also, and that we'll talk about in terms of something that we're going to keep in the future.
And just very briefly, because we actually do plan on publishing the actual data that we've collected over the past year or so in comparison to the program's inception. But what we will say during this time is that rates of restoration were quite comparable to our fully in-person program. The only major difference, I would say, would be the length of stay regarding how long the justice involved individuals were actually on the unit. And a lot of that had to do with restrictions regarding the health and safety procedures within the jail. So there may be a little bit longer period of time on the front end, getting them on the pod, and definitely a longer period of time on the back end, getting them back off the pod. And so that's what I'll say there. But I think that preliminary findings are pretty promising in terms of rates of restoration. And in terms of the supervision model for trainees, those who aren't familiar with correctional forensic settings may not be aware of kind of the in vivo experience that you acquire in terms of receiving supervision as a trainee, or kind of the truly apprenticeship on the job type supervision. In addition to that type of supervision, we were also able to establish a more structured video conferencing type of supervision that gave it more of a traditional feel that you may find in a college counseling center if you're a trainee, in that, taking apart articles, breaking them down, that type of situation. That was something that was definitely an added benefit. And in addition to, more structured supervision, there were also opportunities for postdoctoral residents to act as supervisors and then actually get feedback on their supervision, which was coined or termed supervision of supervision. And there were a lot of things going on with the onset of COVID-19. Of course, we were talking about adding technology and the use of technology, but also there were a lot of diversity related issues that were going on in the world around us. And, our justice involved individuals and the staff don't live in a vacuum. And so those were things that were affecting everyone. And so I would say another added training benefit was this participation in social justice issues that a lot of the postdoctoral residents, including myself at the time, pre-doctoral interns, where we were writing blogs about certain experiences and certain diversity initiatives, engaging in diversity discussion, being more intentional from the leadership down to the actual people who were providing direct services in terms of infusing culture and educating ourselves more robustly and or comprehensively about issues facing the populations that we serve.
Definitely advocacy became extremely important.
And finally, Tamina and I will both probably comment on this, but there's a lot of takeaways from the switch to technology services. A lot of the special programming remained, and that special programming not only was an opportunity or an outlet for the justice involved individuals, it also improved social and communication skills. It was a way to foster community that you might see in a milieu setting. And those are the type of things that we think are unique markers or indicators of how jail-based competency restoration can be something that is much more improved than maybe we see in the general structure. But there was this idea, this notion of a loss of human connection, because depending on the deficits that individuals are experiencing uniquely, some people need that type of interaction, that one-on-one, that kind of person-to-person uh, feeling, or and that was something that was somewhat lost in that time where it was only technology. And of course, Tamina can speak a lot to this, but the change relationship with jail personnel was definitely much more close knit and in need of a lot of coordination. I'll let Tamina
Yeah, I was
finish
going to say on both things. The
that.
special programming was really important, and we didn't realize it as we were going through this process. We were so focused on getting work done, evaluations, making sure people had groups, etc. And when we added it, we ended up having some music programming and some other things like around holidays. And we realized that helped people not just with their communication. A lot of the things that are important for competency, having an ability to assist your attorney does require communication, socialization, planning, and those sorts of things. So that was an added benefit. And then related to the security issues, we have our officers doing ADLs, making sure people are bathing, etc. We make sure that they are compliant with medication, so they actually do pill checks on the people who are involved in our program. And then they had to add this additional piece of technology. And I'll say that since we've gone back to the jail, they're very relieved that we're not in that phase anymore, but they're also more receptive and willing to and feel more part of our team, I think, from that experience overall. So we're indebted to them is the bottom line. But I was going to say some of the things that we want to hold on to from this are, we're going to put them in our paper, but we also wanted to, hold on to some of the research pieces, because we're now able to run meetings, probably like a lot of people, where we can have our old postdocs coming to meetings and participating in research, and it just feels more inclusive and collaborative. So I guess we're proud of our program, we're excited for what's to come, and we're grateful that you were able to tune in today.
Absolutely. And here's some of our references, which will be provided to you.
So I am Alexandra Lugo, and I'm going to now take over and talk a bit about privacy and confidentiality considerations when implementing telepsychology within forensic contexts. So I'll begin by discussing some existing barriers to mental health services among forensic populations, including both treatment-related and person-related barriers. I'll then discuss some privacy and confidentiality considerations specific to correctional settings. And then I'll move into talking a bit about the forensic population in the community, starting with hitting on general considerations, and then moving into discussing those specific to privacy and confidentiality again. And I'll wrap up by noting some recommendations for reducing and/or removing barriers related to privacy and confidentiality concerns. So as we've talked a bit about, telepsychology has seen increasing adoption in forensic contexts. Still, in many settings, the onset of the pandemic necessitated a rapid shift to telehealth services. And in a lot of cases, this highlighted various privacy and confidentiality concerns that are particularly salient among forensic populations. Additionally, many of these concerns are closely tied to existing barriers to mental health service utilization and engagement specific to these populations, and thus have the potential to exacerbate those barriers. So there are various barriers to treatment utilization and engagement among forensic populations, both in correctional settings and in the community. So first, take a moment to think about what some of those might be. A lot of research has differentiated between person-related and treatment-related barriers, particularly among these populations. So to look at the treatment-related barriers, one that first comes to mind is the correctional or forensic setting itself. And this is in part because these settings, as some of the other panelists noted, are not necessarily treatment-oriented environments in nature. So other treatment-related barriers include limited resources for mental health healthcare, including treatment spaces and staffing issues. Also limited programs. So this could look like having a limited variety of treatment programs available, like a lack of appropriate treatment programs for specific problems such as serious mental illness or co-occurring disorders. Additionally, for existing treatment programs, there are often long wait lists. So in terms of person-related barriers, these include things like stigma surrounding mental health, stigma surrounding sexual offending histories, and mistrust of healthcare providers, particularly those working within the criminal justice system. So when we think about the stigmatization of mental health problems and treatment, a lot of research in correctional settings has found that inmates tend to hold negative judgments and perceptions of psychiatric patients. Further, this perceived stigma can delay or prevent help seeking for mental health problems among this population. This also has been found to be even more salient among young ethnic minority males who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So additionally, individuals with sexual offending histories face an additional stigma, occupying often lower rungs of the prison hierarchy and experiencing hostility from other inmates. Another concern is the mistrust of healthcare providers, which is closely tied to privacy and confidentiality concerns. This includes things like concerns that information disclosed in therapy may be used against them in the criminal justice system, such as by correctional officers or parole officers for those in the community. So of note, as I mentioned, a lot of these barriers are compounded among racial and ethnic minorities, among whom there is a greater perceived stigma surrounding mental health problems and treatment, and also historical mistrust of both the healthcare and criminal justice systems. So again, as previously mentioned, racial and ethnic minority groups are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And I've just provided kind of an overview of the racial disparities in prisons as of 2018. Notably, the statistics for forensic populations in the community, including those on parole and probation, are pretty consistent. And when we take a closer look at the data in this area, there are also additional disparities in factors that can have an impact on mental health. So disparities in sentence lengths and things like use of solitary confinement as well. So further exacerbating these issues is the fact that racial and ethnic minorities are also underrepresented among healthcare providers. And so this can contribute to that mistrust that I mentioned as well. So when considering the impact of telepsychology on these barriers, first, it's important to note that the implementation of telehealth services in correctional settings is not inherently problematic. Conversely, it may help reduce a lot of treatment-related barriers by increasing the availability of and access to services. However, when paired with custodial factors, such as lockdowns due to safety and security threats, like those that went into effect with the onset of the pandemic, additional privacy and confidentiality considerations are important. So, for example, during lockdowns, which often occurred during the onset of the pandemic to prevent the transmission of COVID, um, that would leave a lot of inmates like precluded from leaving their cells for extended periods of time, including to receive confidential treatment. So that then in turn resulted in a lot of settings using cell front video conferencing services, which looks at least at the correctional setting I have been training at, like a nursing staff member basically presenting holding up like a laptop in front of a cell. And again, they're often escorted by a custody officer as well. So the patient is engaging in therapy, just cell front. And there really were no opportunities for confidential treatment during that time. So as you might expect, this could exacerbate both treatment-related and person-related barriers. When looking at treatment-related barriers, there may be limited video conferencing resources available in the first place, so including telehealth equipment and staff to operate it, which can result in decreased frequency and duration of clinical contacts. Also, for person-related barriers, this is where concerns regarding stigma surrounding mental health problems and treatment and sexual offending behaviors may be particularly challenging to overcome. So in practice, this could look like treatment refusal altogether, or for those who continue to participate in treatment, there may still be ruptures in rapport and slowed or stalled treatment progress due to patients' hesitancy to discuss various treatment content in this non-confidential context. So in turning our attention to the forensic population in the community, I think it's important to first consider some general challenges faced by these individuals. As a whole, forensic populations in the community face a number of challenges, especially those who are on parole or probation and are re-entering the community. And these things can often have a negative impact on mental health and also increase the risk for reoffending. This includes things like a lack of access to reliable transportation, unemployment and underemployment, homelessness or other housing challenges. And again, of a lot of these challenges, housing is often cited as one of the highest priority needs and also one of the most difficult to meet due to this population having limited financial resources upon reentry, there being a lack of available affordable housing options, especially depending on the county, and high housing application rejection rates, which may be attributed to criminal records. And then as I'm kind of focusing on for individuals with sexual offending histories, additional residency restrictions pose a further challenge to them obtaining stable housing. So these housing challenges perhaps pose the greatest threat to privacy and confidentiality that's necessary to use when engaging in telehealth services. So again, this is particularly salient to individuals on sex offender registries who may also be mandated to treatment in a lot of jurisdictions. So due to the aforementioned barriers to stable housing, particularly these residency restrictions for registered sex offenders, not surprisingly, a large and increasing proportion of this population does not have a permanent address. And so this may look like them either living in transitional housing programs or experiencing homelessness. And this poses a lot of issues. So it may result in limited access to resources to engage in telehealth services, such as no access to electrical outlets to charge smart devices that would be necessary, lack of access to reliable internet. It could also mean that these individuals struggle to find private spaces to engage in treatment. So one potential solution, as I mentioned, to homelessness for this population is transitional housing programs. But again, there are rarely, or there often aren't private spaces. These individuals are often sharing rooms and there's just one big common room. So it really can be difficult for them to find a space to engage in treatment. So how might these issues impact barriers for this population? So as I've mentioned before, for the correctional setting, again, the implementation of telepsychology in forensic contexts in the community actually has the potential to reduce some treatment-related barriers, including like the lack of access to reliable transportation to get to and from treatment. It could also mitigate the issue of few treatment providers in more rural communities. However, these housing challenges that I mentioned in particular pose unique threats to privacy and confidentiality and may augment the existing barriers to treatment adherence and engagement. So in considering the treatment-related barriers, the limitations on technological resources are among the most problematic in terms of accessing treatment. And then also important to notice for individuals who are registered as sex offenders and mandated to treatment, the consequences of treatment non-adherence can be really punitive, and it can include things like parole violations and incarceration. In considering person-related barriers, there can be increased concerns regarding the stigma surrounding mental health problems, and particularly around sexual offending histories. So again, these are difficult issues for patients to discuss in general, and then in particular, if they don't have a private space to engage in treatment. So this can contribute to decreased treatment motivation and engagement, which is already relatively low among those mandated to treatment. It can actually reduce even their motivation to find like private treatment spaces. So this is a difficult barrier to overcome. So I would encourage you all to take a minute to consider some potential solutions or workarounds for some of these barriers. So as far as my recommendations, first, I think it's important to distinguish between person-related and treatment-related barriers, as this can allow for a more targeted approach to reducing and mitigating them. Importantly, addressing treatment-related barriers necessitates changing systemic and institutional policies and practices. So that could look like advocating for adequate resources for telehealth. It could also look like advocating for policy changes, including looking for opportunities to use video conferencing, but in confidential settings rather than self-rent. And then when we're targeting person-related barriers, this requires focusing more on individual attitudes and beliefs. So addressing these in the room with patients, even just by naming them for them, possibly querying them about their concerns, trying to get a sense of how like stigma surrounding these issues may be presenting for them, and then challenging like distorted beliefs when appropriate. And then in terms of research, further research does need to be conducted in this area to document these problems, as well as the impact of them on mental health treatment experiences and outcomes. And then also exploring and evaluating some of the potential solutions used to address them. So I would also just consider continuing to reflect on how treatment-related barriers in correctional settings could be addressed, how those in the community could be addressed, and other potential strategies for targeting person-related barriers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julio Cespedes, and I'm with the University of Mississippi Medical Center with our Center for Telehealth. And with me today is...
My name is Ella, and I'm also with Julio here at the Center for Telehealth.
Ella is one of our project analysts here who works on telehealth projects, specifically in the correctional settings. And my name is Julio again, and I'm the Director of Innovation, Program Design, and Implementation at the Center for Telehealth. So Ella will share with us what we plan to do today.
Sure. So today we hope to give you an overview of the University of Mississippi Medical Center, as well as our Center for Telehealth. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the demographics of our corrections population and the justice system and the need for mental health treatment across Mississippi, and discuss some possible solutions using telehealth to serve these communities.
Thanks, Ella. So yeah, just starting really broadly, Mississippi is a state with a very vulnerable population. There's one or two urban centers in the state. Most of our population is more than 40 minutes away from any type of specialty care in 62 out of 82 counties. So we're really focused on how we can leverage technology and tools to really create a path for well-being and prosperity that looks more like the right side of this slide versus the current state, which is on the left. Our justice involved populations are very much affected by the pathways to help on the left. There's often a lot of duplicate assessments, a lot of barriers for them to go through when they're seeking help, whether it's in the healthcare space that we're focused on, or just basic needs like food or internet access or education and different programs. Here at the Center for Telehealth, we've been actually doing telehealth for close to 20 years. For us, because Mississippi is such a rural state, it was a critical need that we had to address many years ago. And so since then, it's really led to an expansion and a robust program here. We currently offer up to 200 different specialists all across 35 different medical specialties within our academic medical center via telehealth. And so the way we leverage telehealth across the state of Mississippi is in kind of these three main veins. The first one, which you guys may be very familiar with, is telemedicine or audiovisual interactions. And we use that in outpatient kind of stable populations, but we also use it in acute settings like emergency departments. And then, we also do two other main areas of telehealth. The second one called Store and Forward, where it's all about how we leverage clinical information and get it to appropriate clinicians, not necessarily real time, to drive clinical decisions and ultimately benefiting the patients. And the third way we are currently using telehealth is remote patient monitoring. So in the last 5 or so years, you've seen a huge rise in wearables. And so we use that in very specific clinical contexts. Specifically in behavioral health, it's really thinking about how we can be supportive of continuous care and not just episodic care. Thinking about how, giving a patient a tablet where there's a 10-minute check-in or something that's self-guided, how that can inform treatment teams within our health system in terms of, how a treatment plan is going, and we're able to intervene in a much more proactive way versus a reactive way. Wanted to kind of put this in here to get the audience to really think about this. We're in a really amazing era of healthcare where there's a lot of digital and technology tools that are really affecting how healthcare delivery happens. And so this is a non-clinical example. This is thinking about banking, personal banking. And so think for a moment how you would feel if you had the opportunity to FaceTime with your bank teller, and the bank teller via FaceTime could help you submit an online deposit slip and schedule, a time that you could come to the bank to deliver your check to be deposited. So this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek example. Thank goodness that banks did not leverage technology to come up with this process for depositing checks. Instead, today, many of us that may be participating in this presentation are able to just simply take a picture and deposit the check and see money in our account. So I think this is kind of an important example to show because it's for us, we're really focused on being digital and really thinking about how do we not recreate the same barriers and problems that we see in in-person care by just simply virtualizing existing broken systems? How do we really think creatively about leveraging all of these different technological approaches to ultimately benefit the patient in terms of their experience and their access to care in a novel way? So how we do that in our institution is we really think about, again, whether it's audiovisual telehealth, whether it's store and forward of clinical information, whether it's monitoring, we view that as kind of three main tools. And depending on the clinical area, we very much let the clinical vision and clinical need drive how these specific tools work up along a care pathway. And we very much let the clinical vision really drive how we put together some of these programs. So, it all starts with the clinical vision, and then that drives the technology that's used. Sometimes it might mean a very inexpensive webcam. Sometimes in a remote hospital setting, it might mean very expensive hardwired equipment that has, stethoscopes and all kinds of things. But, very much the clinical need is what drives that vision. Then we really kind of develop a strategy in terms of, 3-month goals, 6-month goals. Is this going to need outside funding? Then we really get into the implementation planning stage and really focus on operationalizing everything. And, we do this across a lot of different specialty areas. So it's important that we design pilots with an outcomes focus and a very specific clinical need that is met by the approach that integrates telehealth. And then ultimately, if those pilots are successful, they kind of turn into established programs that, then expand kind of at a network level. So one quick example of that is our teleemergency program. Currently, 20 emergency departments across the state of Mississippi are connected to our emergency department, which is the highest level trauma center in the state. And at those rural emergency departments, our emergency medicine physicians are able to manage patients that show up there, not only for trauma-related disorders, but we're also layering in acute behavioral conditions, a lot of different things that can happen. And all of that started as a pilot, 15 plus years ago. So zooming out some more, we're really in a really amazing time where telehealth and digital health and all of these tools and technologies can really affect and transform across the entire continuum of care. On the far left side, we're working on virtual learning communities and helping, isolated community-based providers get connected with, specialized providers in a kind of case-based learning model so that then they feel more comfortable practicing beyond what they thought was their scope of practice in a rural setting, all the way from access, to prevention and identification of disease. And then obviously on the treatment and management side of disease, there's so many opportunities for telehealth and digital health to really transform how we think about traditional interventions. So, ultimately how we're looking at this and wanting to do this in behavioral health, especially in Mississippi, because again, it's such a rural state, is we really want to be focused on empowering often rural, isolated, community-based providers by getting them plugged in with virtual learning models with specialists here at our institution, then integrating targeted, specific behavioral health interventions via telehealth within their practice, and then really thinking about an in-person referral for very specialized conditions. Because again, for Mississippians here, a referral to us might mean a 2+ hour drive. And when you combine that with a lot of other vulnerabilities like access to transportation, it can end up being that, people just simply don't have access to specialized care. So, what we're really focused on is thinking about how in the next, 5 to 10 years, instead of it being about brick and mortar networks of access, thinking about how there can be a virtual or digital front door that really helps personalize how people can access care. And then that intervention that is all virtual may just be enough. Or if necessary, that can kind of drive the integration with other kind of in-person interventions that might happen in a traditional brick and mortar setting. And so, thinking about that in justice-involved populations, it might mean, in terms of transitions of care, when someone is transitioning from corrections, thinking about how a primary tool for access might be a phone or a tablet that's given to them, and then that might integrate with something that's brick and mortar, depending on just what that specific patient's need is. So I'm going to turn it over to Ella, and she's going to kind of start zooming in some more on our justice system in Mississippi and just kind of our corrections work specifically.
Thanks, Julio. So you may know this, you may not. Mississippi is actually experiencing an incarceration crisis that has really been driven by a reliance on some long sentences. So for every 100,000 people in our general population, 652 people are currently in prison. So this is the second highest incarceration rate in the nation, with a total of 21 correctional facilities across our state. So this is a really big, important part of our population and our community health. So as we see here, we have about 35,000 individuals on parole right now, with our total inmates near 20,000. So this is a really large population, but what we're wanting to focus on today is the opportunity of telepsychology to help with this population. So our probation statistics show that by offense, the majority of our crimes are coming from drug and nonviolent offenses. So these are really people who are great candidates for telepsychology and as well as substance abuse therapy. So it's also really important to think about some of the misconceptions and stereotypes that are at work in this population that can be a barrier to care. So the majority of our justice-involved population is male, and sometimes there are some biases and thoughts about masculinity related to receiving mental health care in this population, as well as the majority of our inmate and probation population is African-American males. So as you can see in the past year, the most dominant demographic for mental health service use is among white women. So we really are working with a vulnerable population here. And in Mississippi right now, there are about 3,000 inmates receiving mental health treatment, and about 15,000 of our population have self-reported abuse of alcohol and drugs. Though we do believe that these statistics are underrepresented, and these groups are underidentified with the difficulties they may have to access mental health and substance abuse treatment. So going again to look at some demographics, so 63% of the male population is African American, and so Black people with mental health conditions, particularly schizophrenia, bipolar, and other psychoses, are much more likely to be incarcerated than other AIDS. So this is really just a vulnerable population we want to emphasize. And so when an individual in the justice system is duly diagnosed with mental illness and struggling as well with addiction, it's very possible for them to be entangled with the criminal justice system. So a really high percentage of the prison population is not receiving treatment for mental health conditions and substance abuse. So some of the opportunities that we work with here are providing individual and group therapy as well as substance abuse mental health treatment. And this has really been linked to successful outcomes once diagnoses for individuals have been identified and assessed. So some more barriers to providing this care for our population is low funding for the current staff in the judicial system, as well as in replication of this model. Sometimes funding can be a really big barrier and concern, though in a community monitored or judicial setting, if any computer already exists and if it already has a webcam, then it is capable of providing teletherapy. If not, an extra webcam is between $50 and $60. So it's really not out of budget for a lot of people. Once you really see what the volume of your clinic would be and how many clients you would need, this need will drive your technological requirements. And where we've seen successes in this model is when our team builds a relationship with the judicial system here. So if a therapy appointment is mandated by a county or state judge, then our clients are going to be more likely to adhere to this treatment. And so this population can either be supervised in the community through parole or individuals who are currently incarcerated. But we found it really beneficial to build community relationships with the team members in all aspects of care. So generally, we also are able to provide medication management for this population in the corrections facility. So we're able to both provide medication and traditional telepsychology therapy for individuals.
Thanks, Ella. Yeah, so just zooming way out, both in the correctional setting and then even we're exploring this in the school-based setting, we really want to explore and think about how in some of these settings, kind of the historical pathway to addressing behavioral issues and more complicated issues has been very non-evidence-based, whether it's verbal discipline or, some type of escalation that is very punitive and doesn't really have any evidence behind improvement, even in the behavioral issue itself. And so just really thinking about how the power of telehealth, especially in a state like Mississippi, really allows us to build networks of resources and is a workforce multiplier. We have limited behavioral health specialists here in Mississippi, and through telehealth, we're able to provide the amount that's needed wherever it's needed. So, if a particular jail or correctional facility has a patient population that justifies a 1/2 day clinic once a week, we're able through telehealth deliver that precise amount of care to that facility. And then, where it also helps on the workforce side is, we will have sometimes individual behavioral health providers that might be interested in giving back or might be interested in just providing some support in terms of capacity. And, again, because we're a rural state, instead of if a person has 4 hours available of clinical time per week, instead of losing 2 of those hours in driving to a facility, we're able to set up their home or their office with the necessary equipment, a webcam, and just some equipment to facilitate the encounter in terms of software, where they can provide that clinical availability to wherever it's needed. So it ultimately maximizes the existing workforce that we have and really helps, especially in these rural areas where it's very, very difficult to try to hire or recruit a resource, much less a part-time resource. Long-term, we really want to explore how this type of model can also have some secondary clinical benefits in terms of standardization of quality standards, and how it might lead to, just overall better, higher quality healthcare in comparison to if each of these individual facilities, hired, different types of resources, and it would lead to just a lot of different types of approaches. So yeah, just ultimately, as the only academic medical center in the state, we are really focused on leveraging telehealth in a strategic way, where we really want to think about access networks. So we have a lot of individual clinics, or sometimes individual jails or correctional facilities that are asking for help in terms of access to behavioral health. But from our perspective, it's okay, how do we think about the fact that we have 20 rural emergency departments where someone can show up with an acute condition? How across the state we have a lot of different clinics, and so ultimately, how do we position more specialized interventions in an integrated way across all of these communities, to where any individual is not too far away from accessing them? So kind of transitioning from a mission-based approach, where it might be we're helping an individual with some availability to specialized care, to really trying to intervene with access at the population level, to where no one would be too far away from anything. So this same network approach, just kind of zooming in terms of pediatric behavioral health, we provide via telehealth medication management and other interventions in the correctional setting for children. And then we also have telehealth in transition programs, residential treatment programs, or home-based treatment programs. We're currently doing a telehealth pilot for behavioral health in schools, and then also doing it in primary care practices and community mental health centers in the emergency department, and then collaborating with our Department of Mental Health. So the idea here is ultimately really work towards a model where for our, tertiary facility in terms of our own emergency department, or for our Center of Advancement of Youth, which offers very specialized behavioral health care, how can we really have proactive inbound flow to these very specialized facilities that makes sense, versus reactive patient inflow that is just kind of based on, okay, this is just what's closest, or some other factor that may not really maximize the intervention. And so we really want to think about this network-based approach, where we're able to really meet different types of populations depending on where they are, and according to physical location. So yeah, just kind of zooming way back out, it's a really, really exciting time for healthcare. The pandemic definitely brought to light just the power of telehealth, and just exposed a lot of people to it, and which we're really excited about. And we just really see an opportunity over the next couple years to really put a strong evidence base behind these interventions, in terms of when and why and how they can be most impactful, and just really help us think in a very different way in terms of how to transform care delivery, and ultimately hopefully benefit a lot of patients, including our very vulnerable justice involved populations, and really get them care in creative ways that we never thought would be possible. So that's kind of all we had for everyone today. And here's our contact information in case there's any more specific questions about any of the things we shared with you today. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Guyton, and I am going to be co-presenting with Ashley Batastini, whom you've already heard from earlier today. And we are the co-chairs of the American Psychology and Law Society Telepsychology Task Force. And so we're going to be sharing an update on the work that we have done to date. Next slide. So this is our agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about how we came to be and why we came to be, although you can probably guess that given the circumstances of the last year and a half. And so we'll talk about that, our membership development and how we came towards the group that we currently have, our progress to date, which has a couple of little extra things in there that you might not be expecting. So hold on for those. And what we're going to be doing kind of moving forward from now, and some of the lessons that we have learned from some of those circuitous paths that we've taken about if you find yourself in a position on a task force or committee where you're developing some sort of guidance for others, some things to do and importantly, what not to do. So that'll be kind of what we're going to be focusing on today.
All right, hello again, everybody. So just to give you a little bit of a background about how this came to be and to give some credit where credit is due. The idea for this task force was established by APLS past president Jennifer Groskup during her term in 2019 and 2020. And then the task force was kind of formally led by Lauren Coy, who we talked about a little bit earlier, and some of her work, and some other division volunteers who had expertise / interest in applications of technology in this setting. From that, there was this a push to create a more formal task force with strategically selected members and appointed a chair and or a co-chair. And so obviously, as Michelle mentioned, we landed on the co-chair model. And so her and I were formally invited to serve as co-chairs back in November of 2020. All right, so why create a task force on this issue, right? We already have at least some guidelines focused in our area of expertise. And then in 2013, we had the guidelines for the practice of telepsychology. So the kind of the underlying aims of this task force, and I've got the specialty guidelines here on the left-hand side, but really there are lots of different practice guidelines that are relevant to forensic and correctional work. So there are other types of guidelines that could be inserted into this Venn diagram. But the essence is that we wanted to create a task force that closed in more on the overlap or the things that these guidelines are kind of missing, right? So the telepsychology guidelines are more of a generalist set of recommendations that don't really focus on some of the nuances that you encounter in forensic and correctional work. And of course, the forensic guidelines and others that are relevant to our specific work don't hit on as much of the technology side of things. So our task force initiatives here were to, one, develop some recommendations for telepsychology in practice and research. That was something that we wanted to make sure was included within these set of recommendations that other guidelines are not as focused on. And of course, across forensic and correctional domains, not just criminal context, but civil context as well. And then we were also charged with connecting members with telehealth resources. So I'd mentioned that website earlier on that, that the task force had some role in developing or building that resource base. So the first thing that Michelle and I did when we were given this charge was to create a process of developing a membership or people who made up the task force who represented a diverse range of perspectives and expertise. So we first started with a nomination process. We sent out a Qualtrics-based nomination form, and people could either self-nominate or nominate other people. And we had a lot of people who wanted to do this. I think, Michelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was somewhere over 60 people who submitted nominations to be part of this task force. There was obviously a lot of interest in what this task force was doing. So again, we selected members who had at least some experience with telehealth implementation. that, again, had perspectives related to service provision, research, administration, different work settings, career trajectory. So we also wanted to account for whether people were early career, mid-career, later career, because we wanted to get, again, a range of expertise. And we also, of course, accounted for demographic variables. So our task force is made up of people with a lot of different gender, race, other kinds of diversity related characteristics. All right, so these are just to recognize the folks who did kind of make our cut here. Again, Michelle and I are serving as the co-chairs, and this is, you should also recognize Alexandra Lugo's name. She is our kind of student perspective and also brings some unique expertise in prisons and corrections, as you heard her talk about, and specifically treatment of sexually deviant behaviors. And so I won't point out everybody on this committee, but you'll see that, again, the work setting is rather diverse, as well as the primary area of expertise. So we have people working with youth and families, child custody, personal injury, assessment, treatment, corrections, hospitals, academic settings, medical centers, private practice, law office. So Dennis is our go-to legal perspective, where he's got expertise in trial consultation and court proceedings and things like that. So so this is our group, and so far they're just a really excellent group. So I think it's worth spending a minute or two just recognizing their commitment and willingness to work with us on this mission. All right, turn it back over to Michelle.
So yeah, so what have we done so far? We had about 6 to 8 months since Ashley and I were initially appointed. We developed our task force membership that Ashley just described pretty early on, from the end of 2020 into early 2021. And we're also sort of keeping abreast of the updated research literature. So Ashley showed you a page, I think, from her earlier presentation on the APLS website. So we continue to put some additional resources. We pooled our own resources in terms of articles and relevant other materials and publications regarding telehealth, telepsychology, especially in a forensic context. So that part kept going. We also decided that what would be helpful for us is to frame what it is we're doing, right? So we kind of understand the scope of what we're going to be talking about, and importantly, that also helps limit what you're not going to be talking about, so you don't have kind of this never-ending project. And so we came up with a title, the Telepsychology Practice and Research Guidelines. We were really excited because we're going to talk not only about practice, which is often sort of the main focus of guidelines, but really to help researchers in this area working with these vulnerable and protected populations through a telehealth lens. You'll also notice the word guidelines right there. That's going to change a little bit as we go on. But we really saw this as a development of guidelines that would be useful in guiding the APLS membership in these particular domains. So next slide, Ashley. So we crafted the mission statement, and much credit to Ashley because she came up with the skeleton of this that the task force added to. But this is in the next slide, showcase the mission statement. And it really just outlines what we intend for this document to do. So really, you'll notice now the words are, instead of guidelines, we have best practices. And I'm going to kind of keep you on the hook with some excitement there because we're going to tell you about why that change has happened in just a moment. But in the meantime, these are basically what it is that we're trying to do, really laying out some guidance and framework for people who are practicing and researching in this area, people who may have to talk in front of courts or other tribunals in order to talk about work that they've done in these kinds of ways. But really also understanding that the context of that is that, one, we can't forecast and provide guidance for every particular situation. Hearing about some of the work that's been done in Georgia and Mississippi, for example, is somewhat different than maybe some of the structures and other challenges that we face here in Oregon. So we can't have a sort of a one size fits all very specific document, and realizing that people will have to really be attuned to the things that are important and relevant in their jurisdiction regarding laws, administrative rules, various other kinds of things, as well as the ongoing and dynamic nature of the research literature, right? So there was a reasonable degree of research literature pre-COVID on telepsychology, but we know that that is substantially increasing and probably will continue to do so. And so creating a document that's flexible enough to be able to take in and work with the new things that we learn. So the domains that are covered in these are sort of the main areas that are covered in the telepsychology guidelines or best practices are obviously assessment, because there's a lot of forensic assessment happening with people that had to happen differently. Treatment, like we talked about earlier, our colleagues earlier talked about their competency restoration treatment. We're also going to talk about testimony and other sorts of communications. So how do you think about and frame the work that you've done so that people can understand and receive those communications, especially if they are not mental health professionals themselves. Importantly, research and how to think about different methods. And then finally, training, so teaching and supervision of others around these kinds of ideals. So that's what we came up with. And our plan has been our current plan right now is that we are going to take the fall and winter of this year. We'd like to get started in summer, but some of our task force members reminded us that it was summer and maybe the first time they'd had to travel in a while. So we plan to really get started in fall and winter of 2021 and complete a draft of this best practices based on the model that you just saw. And that we get some sort of approval through Division 41 early on next year. And then sometime later in 2022, hopefully at APLS, and beyond that is to disseminate through publication and other domains the work that we've done so that it can be used by clinicians, researchers, teachers, supervisees to be able to implement these best practices.
Okay, so one of the reasons why we are not in a position right now where we're telling you what these recommendations are is that we had several lessons that we had to learn along the way that we didn't know before. Neither Michelle nor myself had any experience creating guidelines or recommendations or best practices or what have you under the umbrella of APA. So there were some learning pangs along the way. All right, so here's another question to ponder. Is there a difference, do you think, between guidelines and guidance in the world of APA? Obviously, if I'm asking you this question, the answer is yes, there is a difference. And this is a difference that, as Michelle alluded to earlier, that we kind of had to learn along the way. So to hopefully save anyone out there some time, we're going to tell you kind of what the main differences are between guidelines and guidance, or other things that you might call guidance are, again, practice recommendation and best practices, recommendations, considerations, things like that. So in our normal world, guidance and guidelines might be more synonymous, but in the world of APA, there's a much more meaningful distinction between those two terms. Guidelines, these are a higher level of practice recommendations. Okay, so guidelines require vetting through APA Council. Notably, Council meets about once every 6 months. And they also require a period for public comment. So some of this is what contributes to or translates to a rather lengthy process in the development of guidelines in the APA sense. Guidelines are also intended for a larger APA professional community. Okay, so it transcends division level communications or recommendations, that it's meant to be basically a standard of practice for the entire field of psychology. And again, it sets a higher bar of professional practice. This is actually a change from how guidelines used to be set up, but in recent years, each guideline standard has to be supported by a summary of research. And this has been described to me or to us as we were learning about this as basically mini literature reviews to support each of the standard that you are holding the professional accountable to. You'll often see guidelines disseminated in the American Psychologist, which is the main publication of APA. They also expire, I believe it's after 10 years, and then that requires an update period, which is very similar to the initial vetting process that can take quite a long time. Some examples of actual APA guidelines include, again, the specialty guidelines for forensic psychology, which just the revision of that took about 10 years. And again, the guidelines for the practice of telepsychology. Guidance, on the other hand, is something that can bypass this lengthy vetting process. But what you need to do is get a disclaimer that statements were not formally vetted by APA. So they can be supported by APA, but it requires a disclaimer that this didn't go through the normal vetting process. To do that, you liaison with the Office of Division Engagement. So there are a number of different engagement officers. I'm not totally sure what their job titles are that are associated with each division. So you'd have to figure out who your division engagement person is. Unlike the guidelines, guidance is a division level statement that is intended primarily for the use of the division membership. Obviously, other people are going to be able to access these guidance recommendations, but they're intended mostly for those within the division. They can be published in other outlets. For example, for Division 41, this could be Law and Human Behavior, the Monitor on Psychology, AP Practice Update, those sorts of things. Guidance or recommendations are also generally focused on specific areas, again, which is why it's more of a division level statement that need highlighting from existing guidelines. So bridging from the forensic guidelines or the telepsychology guidelines. And they can be more of a moving target. And in our case, guidance seemed to fit the moment a little bit better because of some of the need for continued research, right? We probably wouldn't have a lot of, or we would struggle with those mini literature reviews to support all the standards. Some examples of guidance, again, is the Division 12 tele-assessment, and there's a number of other, I mean, these kinds of things come out much more frequently than the APA level guidelines. Okay, we'll turn it back over to Michelle.
Yeah, so we were sort of faced with the dilemma of, do we continue to move towards development of guidelines and sort of this process that Ashley has laid out versus something perhaps less ambitious with guidance. You know, and there's a lot of semantics of really what is the difference between those two words. But as Ashley has said, in the world of APA, there's a lot of difference. And so, you know, we had to sort of look at like, well, how quickly do we want to disseminate this? Do we really want to be working on this for 5 years and not give something to the membership in terms of guidance with, you know, the onset of telepsychology practice in forensic and correctional domains? You know, and really, who is this intended for? Is this intended broadly for all people, all psychologists and mental health providers, or are we really sort of more focused on the people who are going to be working in these public sector settings, forensic and correctional environments, or interacting with those kinds of professionals? And obviously, you know, while this might be interesting for people who work in a non-forensic or non-correctional setting, it's really geared towards people who work within these institutional settings or work with these institutional partners to do this kind of work. And then finally, you know, was sort of a recognition on all of our parts that we just don't have a sufficient basis for the empirical basis that might underline and need to undergird any of these guidelines that would be developed. So if you look at some of the APA guidelines that have been developed recently, they have very strong research bases under those things. And we're at a place where this is still developing, and we may not have sufficient support to be able to definitively offer guidelines. So that meant that kind of to the next, so that we move towards developing guidance. And so that's sort of our procedure now, so that we can get something out quickly, and something that can be flexible with what we're going to be doing. So a couple of the things that, in case you find yourself along some kind of path, within your division, or other kinds of work that you might be doing, is to find out from the outset, from your division leadership, what is it they want you to do. Really have, if APLS or another division or subdivision is going to be tasking you to do something, make sure that they're explicit in what they want you to do, and give you as much detail as possible, so that you're not, with your task force, maybe wasting some time or being confused. Also ensuring that division leadership understand some of these things. Ashley and I didn't know about a lot of these things. We've had quite the lesson in the last couple of months. And similarly, other members of leadership within a division may not understand these things as well. So really having some good discussions with folks, and seeking help when needed. Also, what is the division going to commit to? What do they want to see happen, and what will they support? And making sure that you have a good understanding of that. Finding out who you're supposed to liaison with at APA, right? Because a lot of the work that you may be doing is within your division and with your task force, but because you are a part of APA will have some review, and making sure you understand their process and procedures before you get started, so that you don't waste time or create something that isn't going to go anywhere. And then finally, determining your task force membership, how they're going to work together, and then how you're going to divvy up tasks, right? Are you going to sort of put similar minded people all together on one thing, or are you going to kind of diversify those smaller work groups based on expertise in different content areas or various other kinds of factors? So after a lot of work and text messages, Ashley and I, and phone calls, so our telepsychology guidelines have been transitioned into best practices, hence the mission statement that has been transformed with best practices instead of telepsychology or guidelines. That we are focused and acknowledge that, we have a nascent research base, but it's developing, and we can still move forward and provide guidance to folks, even within, sort of a not fully formed body of knowledge. And that we're going to be able to provide that guidance as things evolve over time. So kind of, we want to leave this with you, right? I'm sure if you're watching this presentation that you have been involved in this kind of work in some capacity, at least in the last year and a half, if not before. And so Ashley and I are really interested in hearing from you. Like, what is it that you think would be helpful? What kind of situations do you need assistance with? Anything that you kind of have for us, we would be happy to know. And so at the end of this presentation, there we go, is our contact information. And I would encourage you to email both of us. But if you email just one of us, we promise to share, and just talk about, what is it that would be helpful to you? Because, we've got our task force together, but we would certainly benefit from having the input of a larger membership of you guys. All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Alex Milkey. I'm a forensic psychologist at Northwest Forensic Institute, and I am the discussant for this great panel that you were a part of today. I'd like to go through and talk about some of what strikes me in terms of our collective knowledge and efforts. And then I have some specific questions, some of which may have answers, some of which may be rhetorical or just for thinking about. we start out with Ashley doing a great job of summarizing mainly the pre-COVID research and what we had looked at with telepsychology and teleforensic psychology. And one of the really great thrusts, the promise of teleforensic psychology pre-COVID was we thought of this as a great way to address issues surrounding equity. Equity between rural and urban areas where there's a great divide between the practitioners that are available and the great need in these rural areas, something that Ella and Julio talked about a great deal. And also equity within the forensic context of people who are in correctional settings and justice involved individuals who simply just don't have the same kind of access that a person who's not in a custodial setting might have. Julio and Ella gave us this great gift. You have such a head start on us in some ways, having worked in the area of delivering medical physical services. You have this model you've implemented on a large, very organized scale, and it gives us something to aspire to and, dare I say, steal from as we move forward and try to build out our infrastructure within forensic and other telepsychology. Alex went further with that, and Alex went and applied a lot of these concepts to our field specifically. A lot of the things that notionally Julio and Ella talked about, Alex talked about. Well, let's look at this. Let's look at this in a really serious, thoughtful way about the kind of issues around equity that we need to think about, but also the threats that we have to deal with, particularly with justice-involved people who may not have same access to technology, same access to private spaces, who have to deal with stigma, often multiple stigma, surrounding these issues. And there's a lot of synergy, I think, between the work that Alex talked about and the work that Ella and Julio talked about. But you know, one of the main differences between forensic telepsychology and what Julio and Ella have been doing is that Julio and Ella talked about, and I was very jealous when I heard this, a pilot program that they started over 15 years ago, and they were able to build this telemedical model over those 15 years. We did it in March and April. You know, everything happened very quickly for us. And, you know, we've been having to figure it out. And that's something that Tamina and Doug really illustrated with their experience in the Fulton County Jail. I get the feeling from listening to you two, Doug and Tamina, that it really went from 1 month business as usual to about 2 months later. It really felt like you had figured out how to turn this into an entirely different and very functional beast. I felt a lot of admiration and pride in the work that you've done there, even though it's not my program. You just did a great job of being nimble, is what it sounds like. And now I know that now 16 months down the line, it's easy to look back and focus on the good. But you know, you looked at the challenges in delivering services, which is, I think, what most people who work in forensics and telepsychology thought, well, the problem is going to be delivering the services. But you illustrated a couple of things that I hadn't really thought about, or I think many of us haven't thought about, which is, you know, how do we collaborate effectively with our correctional partners in delivering services to justice-involved individuals? We can't do it without them. It's their house when you're working in the Fulton County Jail or in a correctional setting. Also, you know, you have this active training program, this active supervision program, and that's the future of our field, is what you're doing there. And there's challenges when dealing with supervision and training issues, and how do you get around that? One of the things that I was really impressed with was that you know, you found a way to make that human connection by trying to put in special programming around the holidays. And you didn't mention it, but I was very curious in your PowerPoint. You talked about a talent show, and I would love to hear about the Fulton County Competency Restoration Talent Show sometime. That must have been great. But you know, as we do this, I'm sure it felt for you, as I know it felt for me, and as I think it felt for many of us who tried to figure out how to pivot during this period, that we were trying to repair an airplane that was in flight as things were going. And that brings us to Ashley and Michelle's presentation. Now, putting aside this question of guidelines versus guidance versus best practice, the job that Michelle and Ashley have is to try and take these two great powerful currents of telepsychology and forensic psychology, and finding where they collide and helping us learn how to navigate those turbulent waters in a way that will get us through safely and effectively, and delivering the kind of services that our justice involved clients really need and deserve. So, I see all of us as approaching the same problem, but coming at it from different areas. And I think, we all together have a fairly complete picture, whereas each of us just focused on our one piece of it. And I have a lot of questions, and I know that we may not have time to answer all of them. But if you don't mind, I'd like to start by asking you, Tamina and Doug, a couple of questions about the practice that you have in the jail there. You guys went straight from one model to another model entirely. And I'm curious, now that you've done it, and now that we are hopefully on the other side, or at least getting to the other side, I'm curious, it's a pretty dark cloud that doesn't have a silver lining somewhere. So what's the silver lining here? What is it that you want to take from this and you'd like to keep? What is it that you want to forget about ever happened with this and just toss out, and please, Lord, never let us never repeat this? And also, going back to what Ashley talked about the promise of equity and leveling that we have with telepsychology, do you think it would be possible to take what you've learned from this period in COVID, implementing your program, and implement a jail-based competency restoration program in rural settings, entirely virtual? I mean, it's real restoration, it's real treatment. So I'm curious, Tamina and Doug, what do you think?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts, and one is very pertinent. Yesterday we have a sister jail at Union City, and we've had pilot programs there from time to time, but we're in the process of trying to work with them on setting up some kind of jail-based program. They have some stuff in the works already, but some of the materials that we developed during the COVID experience, we would like to use there because it is further away from where we are. It's hard to get our people there. And so some of those videos, we had two of our practitioners make a series of about 12 videos that we could show, and the officers could just click play, and then it would be essentially our program. And then it would allow for discussion. We would zoom in and be able to do some discussion around that. So those videos are invaluable, and that process that we developed for engaging people in discussion is really important. The other piece is, this is also a rural issue, but it's also a deaf and hard of hearing issue. I'm a sign language interpreter, and during COVID, I got a lot of referrals for deaf people who are incarcerated. So I was able to I didn't have to drive hours to the northern part of Georgia. I could just click a link and be able to do a quick assessment. So those are a couple of things. This is off topic, but it's about the talent show. The talent show is something that we've had traditionally, and it was, the person who runs it is Vicky, who's very passionate about it. And when we thought, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this virtually? But it was so sweet. At the end, we were all on the Zoom call. We were able to see everyone at the jail, and the jail personnel was there with people. And by the end, we were doing a sing-along with it was like cacophony, like just awful, but we were able to sing this song together. And it was just so sweet, and it was a way to connect, even though we were pretty far away. And I'll just say a couple other things. I mentioned keeping the supervision and keeping the structure of the research meeting is important. And I think one of the things that I would get rid of, or at least do in a modified way, is the evaluations, and the screening for our program, that became a lot more difficult to actually see what the person was like. And we had a very high percentage of people who refused to meet with us in a telehealth form. And so it just prolonged the process of getting someone into our program and evaluated. And I'll say that since we've been going into the jail, at least part-time, I think it's become a lot easier for us to make assessments quickly and move people and figure out which part of that continuum of care that they need to. We don't have as many people that were unsure of what to do with them next. It becomes obvious. So those are the things that I was thinking.
And I'll just add, just very briefly, screenings were very challenging, to say the least, depending on the particular deficits that the justice-involved individuals were experiencing. Also, I would say we had to share some of the technology with regard to screening. So we had to share with attorneys or with the courts. And so managing in terms of scheduling was very difficult. We probably wouldn't want to go back to that. But in that same vein, in terms of the deficits, as people on the call probably know, in deficit, the ability to do an entirely virtual program would be challenging depending on what deficits are being shown or exhibited by the individuals. So for those who may, have a little bit lower intellectual disability or some cognitive deficits, or for those who are willing to take medication, because in our state, involuntary medication in the jail setting really isn't a thing unless they really become a danger to self or others, but really that's not a thing. And so it would probably be difficult to do an entirely virtual program for depending on the deficits that are seen by the individual. But it can certainly speed up the evaluation process and some of the delays that we see when we have to travel, similar to what Julio was saying, certain parts of the counties that I cover now, traveling 3.5, 4 hours, as you can imagine, will cause delays in terms of being able to see people.
I was just going to add to that in terms of being kind of adaptive. We were shocked by the level of technology that the people that we were working with were struggling with. We were adding to their stress in terms of many of them didn't know how to use, had maybe never gotten a visitation call. And so initially we were using the visitation system. They didn't know their codes to get into it. So the officers had to help them with that. It was a lot of administrative things. And we also were short-sighted and were misled in different directions. And by that I mean, we bought a bunch of iPads initially and thought, we'll just do Brain HQ. And then we realized not only is it like way up here in terms of, the concepts and things like that, we needed to make it more relevant to the group that we were with. We did it for cognitive remediation purposes. And then we also realized for some, even using an iPad was a limitation and something that took several weeks to kind of develop. So
that's interesting. I think that, as Michelle and Ashley move forward in developing their best practices and guidance, that some of these questions about who is and isn't good for participation in one of these kinds of programs, I think that that bears examination, and the experience that you've had just jumping straight into the deep end of the pool as you have will be incredibly important.
Yeah, we had a good team. It brought us close, that's for sure.
Well, and if I could add, I think that's an excellent point, will the research literature address the participants' experience, right? I've seen it for, clinical participants and maybe people in the community, but what is it like for individuals in custodial care, maybe with serious and persistent mental illness, to use some of these? And as anecdotally, I've had people who really enjoyed using tablets and getting to handle an iPad and thinking that's really cool. And other people, I think like you guys are describing, where it's scary or overwhelming for them. And so I think that's another area, right, for research as well.
Julio and Ella, what is it, do you think, that we teleforensic practitioners can learn from you? And also, what advice would you have for those of us who might want to piggyback off of some of the systems you've already developed?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, from our perspective, it's really interesting. We've been doing telehealth for close to 20 years, but from March of 2020 to May of 2020, we still had a 300% increase in telehealth across our health system. So it's universal in terms of the pandemic's impact on us. We're actually really impressed with everything we've heard today in terms of really trying to find that balance between practice and research, and really focusing on best practices and guidelines. From our perspective, we've been approaching this at the network building level in terms of collaborating with state agencies and regulatory bodies that would have say over all of the jails across the state of Mississippi, or in kind of other types of correctional settings, working directly with the Department of Corrections and leadership there. The issue is translating from vision to implementation. Exactly what we've heard today from some of the other presentations. It's there might be vision alignment with leadership, at a very broad level, network building level. But then when you get to an individual jail or an individual correctional facility, especially in rural settings, there's a lot of gaps to cross, whether it's exposure to just technology, an existing resource there, just being unwilling to, to have an expanded scope of practice that is supportive of a telehealth intervention in that setting. For us, it's just, continuing to push for that. And so, I think it is going to take a lot more of individual pilots and programs, just really driving the best practices before we think we'll see kind of large scale success of more of a network building approach.
If I can add something, so our group has had an opportunity to work with Julio and Ella and other people at UMC. And if you're out there, if you're working in private practice or a small clinic, or even for us, we were working at a university, but obviously in a clinical based program. And so a couple of the benefits of connecting with these larger telehealth networks, which Mississippi isn't the only one. There's a lot of health sciences centers across the country have telehealth centers, although, Mississippi is kind of at the top in terms of reputation, or close to the top in terms of reputation. But I think something that was beneficial was because they have a bigger presence. And so partnering with somebody who has a reputation in the state and has experience getting some of this federal funding to pilot programs. So for example, our pilot was not restoration treatment, but we were attempting to kind of understand the feasibility of delivering treatment for just people who need to reduce criminogenic and mental health risks. And so we were trying to pilot that and learned a lot of things from that process as well. But I think if you're out there and you're not connected to these networks, that getting connected or kind of figuring out who you can talk to will help that effort to get pilot programs off, or just expanding your own practice. And for us, it was beneficial because our PhD students got really unique training in providing services remotely, both in terms of, just working with the population, but also working with the logistics of it.
One of the experiences that I've had as a teleforensic evaluator, which was unexpected, but I guess makes a certain amount of sense, is it seems like the smaller and more rural or frontier a setting was that we were trying to connect with, actually, the easier it was for us to work with them. You know, it was once we got into the urban areas that we just started to hit brick walls in terms of setting things up. And I think that's probably, now that I'm reflecting on it and having listened to your presentation, I think that, you know, those large settings are just big ships to turn. And I think that's a place where having we're collaborating with a medical partner or partner like your center makes a lot of sense, because you're already in, you already have the relationships and you already have the systems. You know, if you're going into a small setting, there's enough, you know, the implications are not so large. If you tinker and mess up, it doesn't cause a huge problem. But if you're talking about, you know, the Fulton County Jail or the state of Mississippi, you know, a small error can lead to big problems.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that I think our presenters did a wonderful job today. Thank you so much for your thoughtful efforts. I'm really looking forward to hearing how things play out, Michelle and Ashley. Once you've distilled all this down to a liquor we can drink, I can't wait to see what it is, because we definitely, as a practitioner, I need the help. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. You did a really great job kind of summarizing and fielding some questions. And again, all of our presentations, I think, have our contact information. So please feel free to contact us. I know we went a little bit over our allotted time, but you know, you can feel free to watch what you want or don't want. And again, thank you for tuning in.